fired up.
Yeah,
Okay.
there's just a red button on the screen.
Is that how I got this?
We don't have a schedule for this week yet, do we?
No, the law takes are every Tuesday. And when they hit Kinley's got Tuesday, Wednesday.
Okay.
And you do Thursday.
Should be able to.
And it's Sunday, I think, I'm going to do.
Because then
There's
that
only
works.
opening I can.
Claire, don't you listen to that conflict? Come back.
Sunday's Super Bowl.
Sunday's
We
the Super Bowl.
watch
Yeah,
it.
you know, in the afternoon before Super Bowl's like 6:30.
Yeah.
I might be out of town Saturday.
Amanda Stern is running an undergrad competition here in law school and across the street.
Gotcha.
We're not gonna have quorums and all that yet anyway,
Gotcha.
but she needs.
It was a mortgage.
So can we,
Well, we're coming back into town.
okay, so you're out of town Saturday.
Yeah.
Do you want to just do Monday night then that way after the Super Bowl?
Yeah, I'll look with Kelly and we'll see.
I think Sunday's a mess, whatever we get, we're not gonna have a quorum.
Yeah. Yeah. All right.
And having this is gonna be tough.
Right.
So the thing is, Amanda's thing here.
Oh, yeah. Here, what do you think?
Huh?
How you
Oh,
like
God,
it?
I love it.
Your opening was
Love it.
was night and day.
No, it was good.
Oh my
It was
God.
intense. It came out of your eyes.
I'm just like,
Like,
literally,
very red.
I just haven't had time to like sit down and work with it.
Yeah. We're giving Kelly like one more minute and then we'll start.
I think I'm finally starting to understand this.
The math.
Yeah.
But we'll
You were very confident with your math when you were doing it though. Really? Because
Yeah,
did you not see my hands like this?
The trick is not to have your hands out.
Just clean it up.
In that moment.
But I'm glad I actually like get what I'm saying now.
Yeah, we'll make a couple tweaks because we're almost there.
Okay.
We're almost there.
Okay.
We're close on it.
I thought it sounded great, but I have no idea what's going on, and I'm hoping no one else will
You
either.
just said it confidently enough that you can't, I mean,
What are they gonna do?
but for both of y'all, if you get somebody where you're doing the math and they're like, I can't do that math in my head, your response
Like,
is,
you can't do that math in your head. You're an expert.
right, well, but your response is something to the effect of, well, do you have any reason to dispute that I'm doing the math correctly? Or something like that.
I would have went with the hill.
I'd be like, okay, that makes two of us thanks and sit down.
Or if you can't understand it, how the hell was Zeke supposed to understand?
Yeah, really. What was she up to today?
She's helping the full team because we still have no idea if they're competing or not.
Oh, we don't know. Like competing for real or competing for?
Yeah, Brett just had to confirm with us.
I mean, it could go up until like the week of, and
Yeah.
right, and they'd have to do it.
Yeah, our numbers be way off.
Stop it. Well, do you want to just start? I mean, we don't mind if she
Yeah.
comes in.
Yeah. Will that throw you?
Nope, we'll be okay. And we'd ask that all time be reserved for roll call.
Sure.
August 18th, 2013, 11:22 p.m. A quiet night is shattered by a frantic call to air traffic control. Zeke Fortenberry has lost power in his airplane. He needs to make an emergency landing, and he needs to make that landing quickly. Now, Zeke is directed to a runway that gives him a shot at landing his plane. A runway with a lighting system that gives Zeke a shot at landing that plane safely. But those lights never came on. That in Zeke's moment of despair, no matter how many times he clicked and clicked and clicked, those lights, they stayed dark. And today we learned why. We learned that the actions of the defendant, Thomas Thompson, his actions in failing to maintain his runway, turned Zeke Fortenberry's last shot at hope, Zeke Fortenberry's last shot at safety, into nothing more than a shot in the dark. Now, members of the jury, at the beginning of today's trial, Miss Hollingsworth came before you and explained that we represent Miss Madeline Fortenberry. She told you that today you'd hear about how Miss Fortenberry's husband, Zeke, tragically lost his life in a lonely, dark area of Lone Star. She explained that today's case, it really just boils down to two very important questions. Whether Thomas Thompson was negligent in maintaining his runway, and if he was, what role his negligence played in Madeline Fortenberry's husband losing his life. Now, you alone, members of the jury, can answer those questions. My job as an attorney is to walk through the evidence we heard today, is to help you think about that evidence. Now, we all sat in here and listened to the witnesses testify. We listened to the experts give their opinions about what happened that night. We looked at the documents that were entered into evidence. But now it's time for us to start trying to answer those questions. Who is responsible? Who is to blame? What actually happened that night? Now, when answering those questions, it's very important that you understand exactly what you're deciding on, what negligence actually is, and why it's so important today. Now, as the judge will instruct you, negligence is a failure to use ordinary care. Now, a simple way of thinking about negligence is that a person can be negligent when they fail to do something that we would expect a reasonable person to do. And as a result, someone is injured, or someone like Zeke Fortenberry loses their life. Now, in answering those questions and determining whether Mr. Thomas Thompson was negligent, I want you to keep three things in mind. Keep three very important things in mind as we walk through all the evidence you heard today. First, Mr. Thompson's failure to shoulder the responsibility he took on by installing that runway, by installing that lighting system. Second, Mr. Thompson's failure to order the repairs to that runway when he first learned they weren't working. And third, Mr. Thompson's failure to spread the word that those lights, that they couldn't be relied upon, that pilots shouldn't be directed to his property. Now, members of the jury, we first heard today about Mr. Thompson's responsibility, about how this runway came about how it ended up being on Mr. Thompson's piece of property. Now, you heard that many years ago, Mr. Thompson, he wanted a place to put down his personal plane. So, he built a runway on his property. He put a lighting system on that property. He put a lighting system on that runway. Now, you may be asking yourselves, well, if this is private property, why does he owe any responsibilities to anyone else? Why should he have to do anything or maintain his runway in a certain way? Why should the government be able to tell him what he can and can't do? And that's a fair question. A fair question we learned the answer to today. We heard that Mr. Thompson, he sought out and he took federal money when he installed that light. We learned that when Mr. Thompson installed that lighting system, he agreed to these rules. Rules published by the U.S. Department of Transportation designed to keep pilots safe. Rules that apply not to just private airports, but to every airport in the United States of America. Rules that tell these airports all across the nation that they have to maintain their runways and their lighting systems in a certain way. That when they know something is wrong with the lights, they have to go out and fix it. They have to do something. They have to undertake repairs. We heard that when Mr. Thompson accepted this federal money, he agreed to follow these rules. When he accepted this federal money, he agreed to shoulder the responsibility of maintaining that lighting system. Now, members of the jury, today we heard about all the actions Mr. Thompson took in maintaining this runway. all the grand actions he took to make sure that runway was so safe that anybody who landed their plane on it would do so safely, could walk away from their plane. Now the word reasonable, it's been thrown out a lot today. We had the experts sit up here and use the word reasonable. We had Mr. Thompson sit up here and tell us over and over again, well, he doesn't know what the word reasonable means. And that's fair, because there's one group of people who are responsible for deciding what reasonable is here today. There's one group of people who can answer, what is reasonable? What should Mr. Thompson have done? And it's not me, it's not Ms. Hollingsworth, and it's not the judge. It surely isn't Mr. Thompson. It's you, members of the jury. You are the only people who can decide here today if Mr. Thompson's actions in maintaining his runway were reasonable. If he used ordinary care, if he shouldered the responsibility he took on by installing those lights. Now today we heard about two separate and distinct actions Mr. Thompson could and should have taken when he found out those lights weren't working. Two separate and distinct actions that they might seem so simple to us as we stand here today, but on the night of August 18th, they made the difference between life and death for Zeke Fortenberry. Now we learned today that Mr. Thompson, he knew this lighting system, that it just wasn't working. He had been told by some friends of his that they tried to turn on those lights from their airplane, that they clicked and clicked and clicked, and those lights wouldn't come on for them. Mr. Thompson sat up here and told you that 8 long days before Zeke lost his life, he was aware those lights weren't working. He was aware that they couldn't be relied upon. But today we learned exactly what was wrong with those lights. We learned why they weren't working. What had gone wrong? Today you heard from a man who makes his entire livelihood maintaining systems just like these. You heard from Miss Sam Williams, a woman who has investigated these systems, who's installed these systems, who's maintained these systems, who told you she herself went up to South Fork Ranch and looked at this runway, looked at this lighting system, and she told you exactly what was wrong with it, that the radio receiver on it was broken. That's why it wouldn't turn on the lights. She told you that that radio, it could and should have been fixed before Zeke lost his life. She told you that it was Mr. Thompson's responsibility to undertake those repairs pursuant to the rules. It was Mr. Thompson's responsibility to have those lights fixed, and it could have been done before Zeke Fortenberry needed them most. But today, members of the jury, we heard from another person who would like you to believe she knows all about these lighting systems. A woman by the name of Kim Bates, who sat up here before us and told us that it could take upwards of a month to get this lighting system fixed. That to her, that would be reasonable. But members of the jury, let's actually think about what Miss Bates told us. Think about the conclusions she reached. Now, Miss Bates told us that she's never been involved with the maintenance of a pilot-activated lighting system. She's never been involved with the installation of a pilot-activated lighting system. She couldn't point us to a specific instance where she ever worked with a pilot-activated light system. In fact, she told us she never even bothered to go out to South Fork Ranch and look at the lights to determine what was wrong with them. She took the documents that Mr. Thompson wanted her to have, the documents that Mr. Thompson provided her, and used those to come to this grand conclusion that it could have taken him a month to fix these lights. A conclusion that she reached somehow without even knowing what was wrong with them? Members of the jury, you heard from someone today who investigated that lighting system, who knows all about these lighting systems, who could tell you exactly what was wrong with it and exactly what needed to be done. You heard that when Mr. Thompson failed to order repairs to that system, he failed to act in accordance with the rules. He failed to live up to his end of the bargain, the end of the bargain he signed off on with the FAA. Now, members of the jury, even if you believe that Mr. Thompson, he didn't have the means to get out there and fix these lights, they didn't have the money to hire anyone to go out and fix those lights, we heard about a second action that he could have taken. We heard that he could have called the FAA. He could have called air traffic control. Heck, he even could have called an airport. He could have called someone. He could have called anyone to let them know that these lights couldn't be relied upon. To let them know not to direct pilots to this runway. To not to direct pilots whose planes are on the verge of crashing to his piece of property and expect to find lights. Simple actions that could have made the difference between life and death that night. Now, in a moment, Ms. Kloska will likely come before you and argue that nowhere in the rules does it say a person has to call the FAA, that they have to call air traffic control when their lighting system is broken, when it's down for repairs. She'll likely come before you and argue that Mr. Thompson, he wasn't responsible for doing that. He sat out there and said, well, this sheet doesn't give me a phone number, so why should I have to call anyone? And this is where that definition of negligence becomes so important. This is where that definition of negligence applies here today. Because what we learn from that definition is that a person isn't only negligent when they break the law. A person isn't only negligent when they break a rule. A person is negligent anytime they fail to use ordinary care. Anytime they fail to act reasonably. We learned today that when Mr. Thompson failed to spread the word that his lighting system was broken, he was not acting responsibly. That he wasn't living up to his end of the bargain. That he was not acting safely. Now, members of the jury, this is where we get to that fateful point in the night. The point where Zeke Fortenberry realized he needed to make an emergency landing. That his plane wasn't going to make it to Dallas. That he had encountered foul weather, wind speeds greater than he expected, and he needed to make that emergency landing. We learned that Zeke Fortenberry was directed to South Fork Ranch. He was directed to South Fork Ranch by Alex Bell, who told him that there was a lighting system that we heard that Zeke was looking for, that he was trying to activate. We learned that Zeke was directed to that lighting system because Mr. Thompson failed to let anyone know that it couldn't be relied upon. He was directed to that runway because Mr. Thompson failed to spread the word that he had failed to maintain it. Now, we heard about what happened when Zeke arrived at that runway. That as his plane was coming crashing to the ground, he was clicking and clicking and clicking. You have the transcript, members of the jury. You're going to get to look at the last words Zeke Fortenberry said. You're going to get to relive the last moment Zeke Fortenberry lived. Think about what was going through Zeke Fortenberry's mind. Think about his plane falling to the ground in the darkness as he so desperately tried to turn on those lights. But today we learned, no matter what Zeke did, no matter what Alex Bell told him, those lights weren't coming on because Mr. Thompson failed to order the repair. He failed to go out and fix the lights himself. He failed to hire anyone to fix them. He failed to do anything, to take one positive action to try to get those lights fixed. Now, members of the jury, I want you to think back to those two very important questions we mentioned earlier. Whether Thomas Thompson was negligent and what role Thomas Thompson's negligence played in Zeke's death. Today we learned that Thomas Thompson knew the lighting system wasn't working, but he failed to spread the word to anyone else. He failed to order the repair. He failed to speak up. He failed to do anything. Now, Thomas Thompson would like you to believe that he sent an email of grand importance to him, where he directs his runway, he directs his ranch manager to fix his runway. But you're going to get to look at that email. Look for one word in that email that directs the ranch manager to do anything. Look in that email for instructions, for an order, for a command. This man was Thomas Thompson's employee. Look for him undertaking those repairs. Look for him telling someone to fix it. And I'm sorry, members of the jury, you're just not going to find it. No matter how many times you look at that email, you will never find what Mr. Thomas Thompson wants you to see in it, because it simply is not there. Because we learned today that Mr. Thomas Thompson, he failed to spread the word, he failed to order the repairs, and in doing so, he failed to shoulder the responsibility he took on when he installed that runway. Now, on the night of August 18th, this is all Zeke had left. A distress call. A distress call that should have given him the information he needed to find a runway that gave him a shot at landing his plane. A distress call that should have given him the tools he needed to make it home safely to his wife. But what we learned is Mr. Thomas Thompson's actions, the defendant's actions, they made Zeke's SOS, his distress call, fall on deaf ears. It turned Zeke's distress call into a shot in the dark. And we learned why it was so dark that night. Because although Zeke Fortenberry was looking for this, a runway with lights on the sides, a runway that gave Zeke a shot at landing his plane, a shot at making it home safely, we learned that instead of these lights, the only lights that shined on that field that night were the lights of emergency vehicles as workers pulled Zeke Fortenberry's dead body from the crashed airplane. They were the only lights in that field because Mr. Thomas Thompson failed to spread the word. He failed to order the repair. And he failed to shoulder his responsibility. And in doing so, he turned Zeke Fortenberry's last shot at safety, Zeke Fortenberry's last shot at hope, into nothing more than a shot in the dark. Find Thomas Thompson liable. Thank you.
His fate was sealed. From the minute Zeke Fortenberry sealed that gas cap, his fate was sealed. You learned a lot about the FAA today, and PAL systems today. And you also learned a lot about the things that pilots have to do to ensure that their flights are safe. It's not the same as just putting fuel in your car and allowing the fuel tank to go for as long as your car can hold. It's much more complicated than that. It's much more precise. And the FAA requires that pilots make specific calculations before they even take off. And today you learned that Mr. Fortenberry failed to do those calculations. He had to have enough fuel to make it from point A to point B to Dallas. And then for an additional 45 minutes, even after that. You learned today that that required Mr. Fortenberry to have more fuel than his plane even held. So when he sealed that gas cap with the wrong amount of fuel in his plane, his fate was sealed. That plane was doomed from the start. And that's what this case is about. On August 18th, 2013, When Mr. Fortenberry took off in his plane, he was doomed. The plane he was flying didn't have enough fuel in it. He hadn't factored the winds that he needed on his journey. And because of this, the calculations that he was supposed to do, that he was required to do by the FAA, were incorrect. He was never going to make it to Dallas with the amount of fuel he had in his plane, regardless of anything Mr. Thompson did or didn't do. And Mr. Fortenberry's death is tragic. There's no doubt about that, and we are deeply sorry to the Fortenberry family and Madeline Fortenberry about his death. But we have to put those emotions aside in this courtroom, because we're here about the facts and the law. And the law requires that we ask just one very simple question. Who in this case acted reasonably? Now we're going to walk through the evidence and the testimony that you saw today. And when you do, I want you to keep that just one very simple question in mind. Who in this case acted reasonably? And when we do, you will see that the answer to that cannot be Mr. Fortenberry. Why? Because Mr. Fortenberry sealed his own fate when he sealed that gas cap with the wrong amount of fuel. We called 2 witnesses for you today. You heard from Kim Bates, an expert in aeronautical aircraft reconstruction. And Kim Bates told you a few different opinions. The first was that Mr. Thompson was not negligent. So let's break that down a little bit. Ms. Bates told you that this advisory circular from the U.S. Department of Transportation were the rules that Mr. Thompson had to follow to ensure the maintenance of his airstrip. And all this tells us is that Mr. Thompson had to act reasonably in making his repairs. Ms. Bates told us that Mr. Thompson did in fact act reasonably. Why? Because fixing an airstrip like this, a remote private airstrip, it's not something you just go to Home Depot and pick up the parts for. It takes training, it takes knowledge, and it takes skill to make sure that you have the equipment necessary to fix a huge airstrip like this. Mr. Thompson, he wasn't capable of doing that himself. So what did he do? He emailed the person who took care of all the problems on his ranch for him, his ranch manager. You heard that he did that the night he learned that the lights weren't working. Ms. Bates told you that Mr. Fortenberry was required by the FAA to have a certain amount of fuel in his plane. And he didn't do that. Ms. Bates told you that. But then you also saw this NTSB report, an accident report done by the National Transportation Safety Board. And what did they say? They echoed exactly what Ms. Bates told you on the stand today. She told you that Mr. Fortenberry ran out of fuel. It's as simple as that. He failed to do the calculations necessary, and therefore he ran out of fuel. And this report says that too. You're going to have a chance to look through this whole report. And when you do, you'll see that the lack of fuel in Mr. Fortenberry's plane is noted in several places in this report. In fact, Ms. Bates told you, and this report does as well, that Mr. Fortenberry's plane was working perfectly that night. He was perfectly capable, if he had done the fuel calculations correctly, of making it to his destination. It wasn't his engine or the wings on his plane that made him crash that night. It was the fuel. And this report tells us that. This report tells us that the fuel lines were intact, but they contained no fuel. The carburetor was intact, and that contained no fuel. And the probable cause, the very first probable cause that they list as what caused this crash, was The aircraft lost engine power due to insufficient fuel. So let's talk about the calculations that Ms. Bates told you Mr. Fortenberry was supposed to do that night. These are the calculations that we walked through when she was up on the stand here today. And she told us that pilots are required by these rules, by the FAA, to do these calculations. First, a pilot must have enough fuel in their plane to make it from point A to point B. All that means is they have to have enough fuel to make it from where they take off to where they're trying to get to. So in this case, Mr. Fortenberry's trip was 480 miles. Then you have to divide that by the cruising speed of the aircraft. 120 miles was how fast the Piper Cygnet could go. So that means that it would have taken Mr. Fortenberry 4 hours to get to Dallas. And based on the fuel capacity of his plane, that means he would have needed 40 gallons of fuel in his plane. But that's not all. Pilots aren't compliant with the regulations if they have enough fuel just to make it to their destination. Pilots require an additional 45 minutes of fuel in their aircraft. Now, what's the reason for that? Well, a lot of things happen to pilots when they're flying. You could get to the runway and see a plane in front of you, so you can't quite get there. Or you could encounter different winds than you anticipated. So those 45 gallons are there as your safety net. That's why they're so important that you have those. And so based on these calculations, Mr. Fortenberry would have needed an additional 7.5 gallons of fuel in his plane in order to be able to cruise for 45 minutes. That means he would have needed 47.5 gallons of fuel in his plane to comply with these FAA regulations. And did he do that? Absolutely not. There's no way he did that. How do we know? Because his plane could only hold 45 gallons. His plane only had 45 gallons of usable fuel. That means that if Mr. Fortenberry needed 47.5 gallons of fuel in his plane, he was never going to be compliant with these regulations. And that's regardless if he ever flew up to South Fork Ranch or not. This has absolutely nothing to do with Mr. Thompson. So when Mr. Fortenberry sealed that gas cap with too little fuel in his plane, he sealed his own fate, because he was never making it to Dallas, regardless of anything Mr. Thompson did. And members of the jury, that's without the wind. So imagine if we would have factored in what the winds would have done to these calculations. Mr. Fortenberry, flying through a headwind, would have needed even more fuel. So assuming that Mr. Fortenberry encountered not one single stitch of wind on his 480-mile journey, he would have never made it to Dallas. And if that's not bad enough, Mr. Fortenberry didn't factor the correct weather report into his calculations. The FAA, those requirements you saw, also require that a pilot look at an appropriate weather report. So what does appropriate mean? Well, we would think that a reasonable pilot would look at not just the local weather, not just what the weather would be if we stepped outside, but what the weather would be like thousands of miles in the air. So what did Mr. Fortenberry look at? He looked at only the local weather. The local weather that told him the weather for Dallas. So that told Mr. Fortenberry absolutely nothing about the 480 miles he would be flying through. The only thing it told him is whether or not he would need a raincoat when he arrived in Dallas. Mr. Fortenberry was woefully ill-prepared for his flight. We can see that through his incorrect calculations and his incorrect use of the weather. That is not what a reasonable pilot would do. And because of that, Mr. Fortenberry is not in compliance with the FAA regulations. You heard from Sam Williams, the plaintiff's expert, and his theory was that Mr. Thompson was negligent and that Mr. Fortenberry wasn't, that he did everything a reasonable pilot would do. But we just went through all the ways that Mr. Fortenberry didn't act as a reasonable pilot should. Sam Williams said that Mr. Fortenberry acted as an experienced and a seasoned pilot. But ask yourselves, are doing calculations so wrong that your plane can't even hold the amount of fuel that you need reasonable? Does that sound like a seasoned and experienced pilot to you? Does looking at a local weather report that tells you what the weather is like for one little part of your 480-mile journey sound like a reasonable pilot to you? Sam Williams told you that he thought Mr. Thompson was negligent. He told you that owners of a private airstrip are not required by law to install a light system on their runway. And that is true. Mr. Thompson chose to install the lights, his PAL system. And when he accepted the federal grant to build a runway and put in those lights, he accepted a duty to maintain it. But remember, all these regulations tell us is that the repairs have to be made within a reasonable time. And Mr. Thompson did just that. He emailed his ranch manager the night he found out they were broken. Now, Plaintiffs' Counsel talks a lot about Mr. Thompson calling air traffic control. And you're going to have a chance to look at these when I'm finished speaking with you, and you will see. Look at every line in this document. Nothing requires Mr. Thompson to call. There's no phone number. Nothing he could have done. Everything that these rules say that he had to do, he did. Now, we could all sit here and we could all talk about millions of things that Mr. Thompson could have done. But that's not why we're here today. We're here to determine what he should have done. And these requirements tell us what he should have done. He should have called within a reasonable, he should have maintained or fixed the airstrip in a reasonable time. That's it. And he did just that. You heard from Alex Bell. Alex Bell was the air traffic controller who spoke with Mr. Fortenberry that night. Now, she had worked a 16-hour shift before she got that call from Mr. Fortenberry. Alex Bell told Mr. Fortenberry that he could land on the South Fork Ranch and told him that it was a 3-click system. Alex Bell told you that she just assumed it was a 3-click system because that's what all those other private airstrips do. She didn't take the time to find out that Mr. Thompson's airstrip was actually a 7-click system. So while Mr. Fortenberry is up in his airplane, clicking, clicking, clicking 3 times, those lights were never coming on, regardless of whether or not they were broken. And that has absolutely nothing to do with the fault of Mr. Thompson. Now, members of the jury, remember that we don't have a burden in today's case. The plaintiff is the one who has to convince you by a preponderance of the evidence that Mr. Thompson and his negligence caused Mr. Fortenberry's crash. So let's break that down. What is negligence? It means failure to use ordinary care. Failure to act as a reasonable person should. And the plaintiff has to prove this to you by a preponderance of the evidence. And all that means is more likely than not. So if you think that the plaintiff's failure to make these calculations caused his crash, then you must find Mr. Thompson not liable. If you think that the plaintiff's failure to consult the correct weather report caused his crash, then you must find Mr. Thompson not liable. The plaintiff, Mr. Fortenberry, sealed his fate when he sealed that gas cap with the incorrect amount of fuel. And you don't have to think that each and every one of these things we just talked about caused the crash. But just one of them did. And if you find that just one of Mr. Fortenberry's failures caused this accident, then you must find Mr. Thompson not liable. The plaintiff told you that this case was about a shot in the dark. But members of the jury, we just saw that Mr. Fortenberry had plenty of shots before he even took off in his plane. And every shot he took, he did it wrong. He didn't do his calculations. So he didn't take that shot. He didn't check the right weather report. He didn't take that shot. And if he had done just one of those things, we wouldn't even be here today. But when a pilot doesn't do the appropriate calculations that the pilots are required to do by the FAA, they seal their own fate. Members of the jury, don't seal the fate of Mr. Thompson for the mistakes made by the plaintiff. Find Mr. Thompson not liable. Thank you.
Now, members of the jury, Ms. Kluska just came up before you and, well, she gave you her best shot at pulling you over to the side that doesn't blame Mr. Thompson at all, that doesn't put any blame or any responsibility on Mr. Thompson. But this is where it's so important that you focus not on the language Ms. Kluska used or the emotion she stirred up, but on the facts, on the evidence. Now, the defense would like you to believe that because Mr. Fortenberry failed to look at a NOAA weather forecast, he acted unreasonably. They tried to have a witness sit here today and tell you that this NOAA forecast, if a pilot looks at it, they're pretty much guaranteeing themselves safety, a safe trip. But what we learned is that this NOAA forecast, it's actually not that different than the one that Zeke Fortenberry looked at. This forecast doesn't tell a pilot the conditions they're going to fly into 10 minutes into their flight, 20 minutes into their flight. It doesn't tell them what they're going to see out of their cockpit an hour into their flight. It doesn't tell Zeke Fortenberry, even if he would have looked at it, what the winds would have been over South Fork Range. We heard today that weather conditions are constantly changing. Ms. Bates told you that a pilot can never know precisely what to expect when they take off in their plane. That they can give it their best shot at calculating the fuel, but they can never know for sure. And that's why lighting systems like the one at South Fork Ranch are so important. Because when a pilot runs into bad weather, runs into the unexpected, it needs to make an emergency landing. Lighting systems like that come into play. That's why Zeke Fortenberry was directed to South Fork Range. Because in his emergency, in his moment of despair, Alex Bell, a trained air traffic control officer, said that she thought that runway could help Zeke Fortenberry. The forecast that Zeke Fortenberry looked at, it says nowhere in the rules he was wrong for looking at this. It says nowhere in the rules a pilot is banned from looking at this. This gave him the information for Dallas, the weather forecast for Dallas, just like the NOAA report did. Now, Ms. Kluska wants you to believe that this all comes down to this simple, precise calculation. But what we learned is that weather conditions constantly change, and a pilot, all they can do is give it their best shot. That they can look at a forecast and believe that forecast, used the estimations in that forecast, and then set off. What we heard is that had the winds been like Zeke Fortenberry expected them to be, using the forecast that he was allowed to use by the rules, he would have needed 37 gallons worth of fuel to make it to Dallas. And you say, oh, he had to comply with the rules, though. Well, sure. He had to comply with the rules, so he had to carry an extra 7.5 gallons. What does this leave us with? This leaves us with the amount of fuel that Zeke Fortenberry, we heard today, could have carried in his airplane. That had the weather been as Zeke Fortenberry expected it to be, using the forecast he was allowed to use, he would have been in compliance with the rules. Now, members of the jury, there's been all this talk today about responsibility. Who is reasonable? What actually happened that night? But this picture tells the story of what happened that night. This picture tells the story of a man's life cut short. Zeke Fortenberry passed away in this crash. His life was cut short. His fate was sealed. Because of his actions, because of his lighting system being broken, because his lighting system was not maintained, because he was not concerned with safety. Thomas Thompson's actions put Zeke Fortenberry in a position where tragedy was inevitable. His actions turned Zeke Fortenberry's last shot at safety, his last shot at hope, into nothing more than a shot in the dark. Find Mr. Thompson live.